The History of Men, Volume 2, by Themoi Levi. The year of recording is 230 from the founding of the Axis, and the year 3100 from the founding of the Empire. The Rebellion in the South. Now, many contest the exact beginning of open rebellion against the elder races. Now, many men from the South claim that Wodkin Hygino began the rebellion after he submitted the first article of defiance to the Elven governor, Mazira Fesithseth. Elves. The original document of the first article of defiance has been lost to history. The article was supposedly brought to the Elven capital in the human region of Al-Jafal to be debated by the governor. The article stated that human beings are of a separate culture to the elves and should be ruled as such, and at minimum deserve representation as an official province of the Elven Kingdom. The last part noted that if this demand was indeed not met, that he would bring humanity into open rebellion against the elves. The article was supposedly lost in the Elven bureaucracy for over a year before being seen by the Elven governor at all. The article was then sent to be debated on by the Elven king, for liberation of an entire province was more than what one Elven governor could approve of. After a year of deliberation, the article was rejected. Now, that being said, there are some drafts of the document and third-hand copies, such as the one sent to men like Burton Polly, a famous scholar and friend of Wodkin, remains intact despite Polton's being a unionist and an advisor to Mesra. The exact wording of the first article is hard to come by, with many scholars, such as Timon, born a historian, Jordan Mirek, who claims the document was made after the rebellion in the north was a long underway. He claims the document only served to give legitimacy to Wodkin's claim to the throne. I would be aloof if I did not mention a few counter-arguments against Mirek's points. The elves at the same time were notoriously unorganized due to a succession crisis that occurred over the course of 50 years, which conveniently ended when Wodkin's demands finally reached a newly elected king. There are some records of the article being brought to court, but those documents are sadly deep within the Elven capital of Imalnor, and despite my reaching out to other scholars, my attempts to access the article has been denied. Rebellion in the North. Now, other scholars mark the beginning of the rebellion against the elder races to start when Ulf Loman and his makeshift army of 300 knights and 3,000 armed peasants tried to seize control of Blackdehold in the middle of the night. Loman had all his men disguised as regular workers, and the troops at night were to make their way to the gates and to take them from the local garrison. After the gates were taken, Loman was to ride in with his knights and cut down the remaining garrison. However, this was not to be, for the Dwarf King had spies worth their weight in gold. And they gathered a list of Loman's supporters and troops within the city and purged it. A few of Loman's men, who had a chance to fight back, tried, but no such luck, as Loman lost all his men and friends inside the city, and their heads were placed atop the walls of Blogday Hold. Loman retreated with his knights to the Blogday Mountains, hiding out in a small town that rested in a valley between three mountains called Little Pass. Loman, from the town of Little Pass, would hide from the king's troops, sending out riders to gather men from across the kingdom, begging men to join his cause, but with no luck. Loman, a man too stubborn to know when to quit, began to raid elven merchants in small towns. Many dwarves spotted in these towns and caravans were killed brutally. At the time, it would not have been abnormal to see an elf stretched out to the size of a man hanging from a tree along the road. Loman, during his campaign of terror, killed upwards of 20 to 40,000 dwarves that resided between Razlock Pass and Mount Draught. The Dwarf King had to engage martial law over the cities of Deirdre, Blogday, and Little Pass, enforcing what is now called the Loman Act. The Loman Act was a series of purges of all the humans living in those towns. In the eyes of the dwarves, this purge made the grudge between the Dwarf King and Loman, and resolved the matter. This act of slaughter, while only killing roughly 10,000 men due to the Dwarf King's decision to let the women and children live, had a chilling effect. Loman acted quickly upon the act of slaughters and called upon the people to rise up, and they did. The cities of Tilbeer, Conbois, Zine, Warfulf, Yalork, Alma, Sorn, Gotera, Tusi, Pusama, Gesso, Angox, and Hope's Summit all overthrew their dwarven garrisons and declared their rebellion against the Dwarven King. The Battle of Lomoris. Now, Loman rushed north to gather the cities that rebelled against the dwarvish masters, and to gather a big army, or at least as large as an army as he could. Roughly 500 knights and 5,000 infantrymen. The Dwarf King had not been idle, however, and called upon his relatives in the west to support him. The reinforcement dwarf armies consisted of 5,000 veteran troops from the War of the Elkeg and additional 500 ram riders from the legendary family of Grimnir. The reinforcing army, if allowed to muster with the Dwarf King of the West, would have an army of 10,000 strong, well-armed infantrymen and 1,000 ram riders. Loman moved his forces to cut off the reinforcing army by placing his army in the city of Lomira, waiting to strike out whenever the dwarven army arrived in the hills of Lemoris. The dwarf army arrived during the wet season, and Loman did not hesitate and ordered a full frontal assault upon the dwarven line. In the mud and dirt, the dwarven ram riders and the knights met on the wings, and an epic battle began. Horse and ram flew as lances of honorable knights slammed into heads of rams. Horses collapsed from headbutts at full speed from rams bred for war. Men and dwarf alike spilled onto the ground, as Grimnir are legendary warriors, and knights of men clashed. But all men and dwarf stepped aside when Loman entered the field. Loman cut down many a dwarf. With his magnificent black steed, he appeared as death himself, taking all those who stood in his way. until Grimnir arrived. Grimnir, the honorable warrior of the dwarves, and the head of House Grimnir, son of Grimnir, son of Grimnir, son of Grimnir. I do not know how many Grimnirs have passed, because every other son in that family, I swear, is a Grimnir. Loman and Grimnir began to battle, with neither giving inch. Each swing from Grimnir's axe was like a clash of thunder, and each stab from Loman's sword was like lightning. But one mortal had to die. So is the will of death, but death was greedy that day. When Grimnir's axe came crashing down, he slammed into Loman's sword, driving it in two and slamming his axe into Loman's chest. Grimnir roared in victory, only to find his voice cut short, with Loman's broken blade in his neck. The battle of Lemurus ended in a victory for the dwarves, but at a terrible cost. The dwarves lost half their number and no longer wished to fight without Grimnir, and so left with his body and axe. At an appalling cost, the men of the north had turned the tide of the war in their favor, as more cities turned to their side, after what was, if nothing else, a strategic victory. But the war was far from over. The war in the south will be covered in Volume 3.